I'm gonna introduce our speaker today, and John Bunyi. He is our fourth year doctoral student colleague. And the title of a presentation is a digital tools for mental health. That is his passion and has been studying on this topic and for a long time. So I'm really excited to hear about his amazing work. So John.
Thanks so much, Dr. Lee, and thank you everyone for coming to the talk today. If you build it, will they come? That's title based on a quote from the 1989 movie Build Dreams, which I think the quote refers to some ghost telling Kevin Costner's character to build a baseball field, and if you do, then people will come and use it and essentially be a part of it. So generally this stands for the idea that if you build something with belief in quality, people will be drawn to it. But is that the case with digital tools for athletics? So today we'll see if we can answer that question. First, I think it's important that we define what digital tools are. And then to add context to this question, I'd like to share my own background and then share what I've been working on for my dissertation. And then finally, some closing thoughts. So I'm sure we've all heard of the sort of bad stuff that technology can do to our mental health. But who here has even heard of using technology to support mental health? What are digital tools even for mental health? And so I've come to my own definition that helps me define my work. But over my years of work in this area, if there's anything I've learned, I've come to learn that this can take on a pretty wide-ranging definition of what people use in the digital context to support their mental health. So digital tools can be apps for some folks. Some of the most popular ones are meditation apps like Headspace and Calm. Plenty of ads on NPR and podcasts for these apps. Others include telehealth apps, or apps that connect you with a provider like Talkspace and BetterHelp. Others track things like mood and symptoms. And then others provide clinical interventions in an app format, so kind of like digital self-help books. And then others like the journal app from Apple are intended to be solutions baked right into your smartphone. And so there are a multitude of digital tools in the app space from a variety of developers. In fact, one of the sort of gold standards for
Microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Towards you more.
Right. One of the gold standards for apps and mental health apps in particular come from the VA, which offer sort of a suite of apps that address a variety of. So again, I've listed specifically mental health apps here, but it's also worth noting that people do use some, I guess, like general use applications for their mental health. So things like the Notes app on your iPhone for journaling, or reminders to remind folks about medication. And digital tools can also be social media. So Facebook and Reddit have entire communities dedicated to supporting mental health. Arguably, some communities, even if they don't focus on mental health, are a source of support for folks. TikTok and Instagram are sources of mental health information for many. And then so are YouTube and podcasts. And then there's AI. So a little controversial, and I know it's a growing field that's, again, pretty polarizing. But there are consumer products like ChatGPT and Gemini that are readily available. People use this to access mental health information, and in some cases, even act like a pseudo therapist. Then there are more controversial, even more controversial companionship apps like Replica and AI. So these essentially take on a persona and sort of try to provide companionship to folks and mental health support in that regard. And then there are specific dedicated mental health bots. So things like WISA, Wobot, and things in this category, which essentially are AI, but mental health, much more mental health focused. And then other people like to use hardware to support their mental health. So things like virtual reality headsets, Apple Watches, Fitbits. And that brings me to the definition that I've settled on for now. So digital tools for mental health are digital first solutions that people use to support their mental health wellness. So again, a pretty broad definition. I definitely want to acknowledge that there's a whole lot of literature out there that would place this work under digital mental health interventions. But I felt that for one reason or another, that term felt a little too narrow a scope for this work and the work that I'm doing lately. So yeah. How did I get to this definition and how did I become interested in digital tools for mental health? So flashback to my time working as a clinician. I had one student who I was working with in an intensive school counseling program who was struggling immensely with generalized anxiety in class. The student had tried everything with their previous therapist, and frankly, with myself as well, we were going through the CBT exercises, challenging negative thoughts, trying to do mindfulness exercises. And then one day I was browsing around Best Buy when I saw this super cheap virtual reality headset. And this wild idea popped into my head. What if I tried some guided deep breathing and guided imagery, but with VR? So it didn't quite look like this, but it looked a lot more like this. But the reality was it worked as an exercise. The student literally skipped back to class and was happy as a clam. And the teacher was surprised and asked me what happened, right? And so we continued these VR therapy sessions. I even began incorporating things like cheaper Fitbits to try and teach kids about biofeedback, regulating emotions. And it actually became a regular part of my sort of therapeutic toolkit of interventions. And so I started to share this work even to my family and friends, and they even shared that they noticed the positive effects. And so I thought to myself, this is it. I want to learn more about this and dig deeper into this world. I want to learn more about how I can develop digital interventions for mental health. So I did what most people would. I looked into getting a PhD. But before I could do that, I thought to myself, I should get some research experience. So I started as a research assistant at a newly established lab at UC Irvine, which was headed by frankly one of the foremost experts in digital mental health interventions. And there I reviewed apps, took part in projects looking at the efficacy of these tools, projects that utilize co-design to understand what users wanted to see from them. And at one point I even looked like this, where I just had like a suite of phones just in front of me. I was reviewing app after app, and we were finding that the ones we were looking at were pretty effective, in fact, in their own way. So some help people manage symptoms of anxiety, of depression. Some helps challenge negative thinking. Some help people track their mood and understand triggers. And then when needed, some help connect people with professionals. Then there was the Help at Hand project. And I'll call out here really quickly that this is the website to the project. Over here is, if you scan the QR code, you'll be able to see the reports from the UC Irvine evaluation team. But this project was interesting in that the UCI team was a team of independent evaluators assessing the integration and implementation of these free, low-cost digital tools across several counties in California. They were integrated in either behavioral health practice or just open distribution, so direct to consumers. These were tools that range from big names like Headspace to more niche products like MindStrong, or tools that helped folks with schizophrenia, and also tools that counties would build themselves. And so we were utilizing an implementation science framework to try and understand this rollout. But the timing, so right when the project launched, COVID began to surge. A lot of lockdowns were implemented. and everyone was on their computer and everyone was trying to manage their mental health. So we thought maybe this would be a good test of the adoption of so understanding how folks would essentially come to adopt and or if folks would even come to adopt these. And so one of the main findings was that traction was slow. Almost no one was actually using these, even though they were, again, free or readily available. And this was actually backed by a lot of literature that was coming out at the time. So pretty much you see these graphs where if you have 100% adoption on day 1, by day 30, oftentimes the graph would be down to maybe 4% or 5% of folks of the original cohort. And so access, which was one of the main promises or hopes behind digital tools, was pretty low. But more interestingly to me, one of the key drivers of adoption was peer support. Not little p friends and people in your network, but people who were trained paraprofessionals in the community and peers who were often seen as relatable and accessible. And so I thought again to myself, this is it. I'm less interested in having the coolest technology just because I'm not even sure the people who can need it can actually get to it. So I wanted to learn more about how folks can better access these tools when they need it. So to summarize so far, again, I had learned that clinically these things were seen as cool or at the very least interesting or novel by some folks. In research, we were finding that they could be effective, but in real world implementation, it was kind of a mixed bag. So that brings me to my current work, which is exploring the factors affecting AAPI emerging adult use of digital tools for mental health, and exploring how AAPI emerging adults are using these tools to support their mental health. For those who are unfamiliar, the Asian American Pacific Islander community generally tends to underutilize mental health care relative to need. And for this work, I'm using data collected from the Personalized Normative Feedback Project, or the PNF project led by Dr. O. This project surveyed around 2,800 Black and AAPI emerging adults aged 18 to 29 through Qualtrics. And we're also doing qualitative interviews of folks who signed up from that original sample. So for my dissertation, I'm focused more on the approximately 1,600 AAPI emerging adults sample. I'm also using mixed methods, so using logistic regression and starting with 2 main models and using those to build an integrated model of digital needs. And so using my qualitative findings as well to help explain the quantitative work. And then the 2 regression models I'll be starting with are based on the theoretical models I'm using, which are the Seeking Mental Health Care model, as well as the network episode model. And so why 2 models? Well, frankly, one provides a nice structure or a nice flow of mental health help seeking. And the other conceptualizes something that I wasn't seeing in other models, which was the role of social support or social connections. And existing literature also tends to take a more computer sciencey approach, so focusing on theories such as the theory of planned behavior or technology acceptance models to explain the use of digital tools. And while valuable, I do think that it's worth applying more mental health help-seeking models to understanding these issues. And so you can see there, the work is guided by my 2 main research questions. So what individual help-seeking factors affect the intent to use digital tools? And then how do social support, social connectedness affect the intent to use digital tools? So again, this work is for my dissertation. Fortunately, this presentation doesn't count as my dissertation defense, so I'm going to focus more on some early findings and descriptives today. So the overall sample, you can see it's a pretty diverse or ethnically diverse sample of AAPI. There are higher rates of clinical anxiety and depression in the sample. You can, the mouse will show there, but you can kind of see Again, you can kind of see that in the table there. There are also high rates of intent to use digital tools, so folks indicating that they intended to try out or continue using digital interventions. And then here we have the types of tools that were used over the past 12 months by those in the sample. Wellness apps topped the list. So these were apps like Headspace and Calm. So more apps that were marketed or pitched as management of mental health rather than intervening on a particular diagnosis. And I'll note too, we didn't ask about AI in the survey, but we are exploring those. We are exploring the use of AI through the interviews. And then, so we have two tables here, essentially the top reasons for not using digital tool and the top reasons for stopping these digital tools. For those who are stopping use in the sample, cost was a big factor. For those who did not use digital tools, it seems that they got better on their own or perhaps over time or with the help of friends and families. And so given this work involves a qualitative aspect, I thought I'd share some themes that I'm starting to see emerge and a couple of quotes that go with it. First off, friends and family do seem to really influence the decision to use digital tools. There are many quotes like these from the participants, but I really like the one on the top right, which is, if you can see that your friends are using it too, that would be comforting for me. Like you're not the only person who has to reach out for help. You get what I mean? And then, interestingly, there are aspects of AAPI culture that seem to affect the intent to use digital tools for mental health. Not necessarily in design or content, but behaviorally. So for this participant, they felt that mental health was very taboo amongst their family. And so the family essentially likes to make sure that there's this concept of saving face. So the quote is, so it's very secret, which I think, as I mentioned before, my family always wanted to keep things secret, and it being the use of AI for mental health. And then a number of participants also seem to report feeling more comfortable talking to an AI than an actual person. And so there are folks who almost exclusively talk to AI, which again, I understand AI seems to be very, very polarizing, but definitely something worth exploring as far as meeting people where they are. And so these are just three of the themes that I've been starting to see that I wanted to call out. As far as next steps, I finalize the progression analyses. We'll be continuing some of the interviews and starting the qualitative analyses. I also hope to integrate the two models as part of this work. And then as far as contributions, I do hope to move towards an integrated framework of digital help seeking. So understanding how folks are using digital tools to support their mental health. And then as far as implementation, I'm interested in exploring the role of digital tools in mental health help seeking using real world data. And then I would like to use social network analysis to understand this a bit better. I think there's a sort of diffusion related question here. And so I think social network analysis would be a good tool to use in understanding that phenomenon. I also think that I'd like to learn more about intervention development and developing interventions, perhaps one that leverages peers or champions within a network or community to speak up about mental health and start those conversations. So before I wrap up, I did want to address, I guess what's sort of like a big elephant in the room, which is that ultimately these tools do rely on big tech in some way. And I know that big tech doesn't seem to have the best reputation. I think that right now the issue boils down to two main questions, and that's, is tech the answer? I know a lot of folks are sort of combating using their phones and sort of being immersed in them. And so potentially does something like a digital intervention make that worse? And then also, are these the right incentive structures, right? So a lot of these tools, and companies are ultimately driven by profit. And I think there's something off about having what amounts to health services be commoditized and a bit empathetic to social work values. And I think there was one quote in particular from a participant that stood out to me, and I think it calls it out nicely. There's this unspoken acknowledgement that ultimately these apps are going to become money-making tools. And so to answer the question at the top of the presentation, if you build it, will it come? Not sure really. It doesn't seem that many people seem to use them regularly, or at least once they get better, they start to move on to other forms of treatment or getting support. And a lot needs to happen. I think first and foremost that people need to have conversations about these tools even in order for them to become viable options. Then at another level, I think incentive structures again to change for these tools. But again, that doesn't mean that these tools aren't worth something or worth trying out at least. I think for one, it embodies a key tenet in the profession or in helping professions, which is that it's an opportunity to meet people where they are. A lot of folks are digital nowadays. And again, as we're starting to see in the qualitative interviews, a lot of folks are using AI. And so I think it's important to start to understand some of those tools. So yeah, at the very least, I do hope that people start to know that these tools are an option. And at the very best, I do want people to be equipped to use these tools and maximize their utility. So big thank you to the P&F study team. And I just wanted to call out really quickly as well that the Center for AI and Society is starting up a tech and mental health collective group. So folks who are interested in learning more about technology and mental health and how technology could be leveraged in mental health. Go ahead and scan the QR code. And I'll throw in the link in the chat as well for more information. Okay, no problem.
Alrighty, we're gonna open to the floor. Anybody has a questions? Alex?
Great presentation. I think my question is in reference to the peer support that contributed to the outcome. I was just curious about the training aspect as far as who's doing the trainings. Was it someone from the actual community that was conducting them? Like, I feel like those factors kind of influence.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really good point. I for that particular project, the peers, it depended on the category, or sorry, on the county or the city that was implemented. So for certain counties, they had promotores programs, and then so those promotores would essentially be trained in additional with this additional tool of digital mental health interventions and essentially teach people how to use those tools. And so they tended to be the people that were already in the community, that were already integrated in some way, and then just got an additional training. Again, for that particular county, it was the Promotores program. In other counties, it was folks who volunteered as peer support or peer navigators. And so, yeah, it tended to vary, but yeah, definitely training was a big aspect of that.
Thank you, John. Very, very nice presentation and a lot to consider in terms of digital tools and mental health. But I did have a question. When you involve peer support, unlike a formal provider that you sign a consent form and there are privacy issues related to that, with peer support, there has to be some level of disclosure, right? That you have a mental health problem and you're interacting with the peer, or that there might be a structured program for peer support to get you to use or at least navigate the tools, right? So how would you deal with the issue of disclosure of one's mental health symptoms or condition?
Yeah, so I think with, at least in the state of California, the peer support program is in this state of, I guess like being like a paraprofessional, so there's a little less regulation than say becoming a full-fledged clinician, but still regulated in the sense that they are trained in how to handle disclosures and how to handle the need to sort of break confidentiality or address more serious mental health conditions. So I think continuing to utilize sort of those procedures, I guess, amongst formal peer programs. Since again, I guess what I should clarify too first is that the peer support that I was envisioning was more of like a paraprofessional peer, so big capital P letter peer versus more direct social networks. But yeah, I think continuing to leverage whatever structures current peer programs have for us, or peer navigators, things like that. I think.
Yeah, that certainly would take care of more of the formalized relationship and
Yeah.
the privacy around that. But the other issue is addressing the individual's level of comfort
Yeah.
in disclosing to a peer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Couple little questions, some of it's super short. Overarching comment, such a fast moving environment, right?
Yeah.
Trying to have research that keeps track of a very fast paced environment it's gotta be a challenge. First question, you had a slide where it said, why do people not use and why do they stop? Was that only folks, I don't need too many details, was that folks who are identifying themselves as having some kind of mental health problem, or was that everybody? I just didn't quite get what the sample was.
Yeah, so those particular folks had anxiety or depression.
Okay.
Or yeah.
All right. Such a broad collection of tools. What is your, if you had to provide a summary, what is your summary of the state of the evidence for these tools, right? I would imagine that it's growing and changing. And there's probably, I'm just guessing that there probably isn't a lot of super well established evidence for a number of these tools. Do you have any kind of summary that you kind of use to organize what of this do we know works at this point?
Yeah. So well, to bring it back to the first point you made earlier about how fast the field is moving, I think that's evidenced a little bit by AI. We didn't even include AI in the initial survey. But I think as far as evidence base, it is pretty limited. I think at least when I was working as an RA looking at apps specifically, less than 10% of the apps, and there's like estimates of like 10,000 mental health apps out there, and less than 10% of them, so really just a handful of them have I guess like gold standard RCT backing. Because a lot of them do develop initially, or are developed initially by developers who have perhaps had lived experience and then move into sort of mental health interventions. And so the ones where you see that are developed perhaps like a university settings, or more resources are available to do RCTs, things like that. Those tend to kind of be the ones that have more backing. I will say too, again, kind of bringing it back to the incentive structure question, a lot of these companies seem to host their own research. So like Headspace has probably I would say arguably the most RCTs of the major mental health apps. But you can imagine how many studies are sort of like, I guess, have a bit of a conflict of interest with Headspace.
And I guess my final question is, and I apologize for having a little collection. reasons that people are seeking these out, right? Because like some things try and replicate a clinician, right? Some things are designed to provide social support. Some things are designed to provide information so that you can self-help. Do you have a sense of the big classes of like the frequency of reasons that people are seeking things out, if you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
That
yeah,
kind of cross cuts the apps.
it does, yeah, and I think I wish I had the figure up here right now, but in the mental health help seeking continuum, I could definitely see where apps kind of specific apps or specific tools kind of fit into different parts. So if someone was, say, information seeking or sort of like looking to build up some knowledge about mental health, what condition they might be using or experiencing, then I think there are specific class of tools for that versus folks who might be ready to seek therapy. You can imagine that something like Talkspace or BetterHelp might be a little bit more appealing, or even ChatGPT in some cases. Interestingly, I found that folks who do seek out AI, and again, this is from just like a handful of interviews, but like those who do seek out AI have often and are sort of hardcore users of AI. They often tend to have already been through therapy, have seen several providers, and have tried medication, a bunch of other things, but AI is sort of like their what they've landed on as sort of their source of support. I don't feel so great about AI personally, but I feel like there are definitely limitations to it, and so but I also want to acknowledge too that there are people who are using it for help, and so I definitely want to learn more about that.
I see step up on the screen.
Oh, sorry. Yep, there is the ability to deploy LLMs locally. Yeah, a comment in there from Stephen about RCTs as well. I think yeah, they are pretty costly, and I think for perhaps like certain smaller companies who might be trying to provide their services for free or low cost, definitely be challenging to implement an RCT. So there comes sort of a little bit of like chicken and egg question as far as evidence base. And then from Dr. Wu.
Any questions from the PhD students?
Oh.
Any questions or comments? Mental health matters, right?
I help you.
Oh, yeah, so I see Dr. Wu's question in there. If the DMHI is meant to serve people in the early or mid stages, so filling an unmet need in care instead of replacing clinicians. Yeah, I think that definitely certain tools are meant to provide that care. Interestingly, though, again, a lot of them aim to do that. Interestingly, though, again, based on some of this earlier research, it seems that a lot of clinicians are the ones who are referring the clients to the tools, and so it ends up kind of being more of like a sort of like a tool for maintaining some of the work that's been done in therapy, which is a good thing. But again, also like how folks come to even access these tools is a question. Are there existing models that demonstrate hybrid models that include adult therapists? Yeah, so there's actually a lot of good work being done by Dr. Fortuna, Karen Fortuna, and she looks at peer support for implementing digital tools and digital mental health interventions, but her work is often focused on a specific application. I think it'll be useful too to kind of look at perhaps training folks on a broader set of tools or a toolkit that folks can access. Network theoretic approaches. Yeah, so I'm really interested in sort of understanding the conversations that people have around these tools. In particular, I think actually Dr. Rice and I have talked about this a lot in the past. So, are people even having conversations around these tools? Because I think um, part of the theory is that with anything that is new or novel, of course, you're looking for some sort of diffusion, some sort of network effect where folks talk to each other about something that works. And I think we saw a little bit of that with tools like Headspace, which are again pretty widely adopted. You saw high-profile names, figures using Headspace to support their mental health, but I think beyond those, beyond Headspace and Calm, I think there's really not much in terms of conversation happening. Um, yeah, that's a really great comment from Tasha as well. Of seeing a client clinician match based on race or ethnicity and other identifying factors that makes folks less likely to feel like they've run out of options in terms of AI.
Can I see Eric saying?
Oh, sorry.
Eric?
John, this is a great presentation. And you and I have had a lot of conversations about some of these issues over time. I was thinking while you were talking that I have perhaps a naive assumption or hypothesis, maybe I'm not quite sure what to call it, about people using AI for therapy bots, right? So there's been, a couple of initial clinical trials showing that those things are, able to deal with sorts of issues like depression or anxiety that we have manualized interventions for and these sorts of things, so you can train those bots. But I'm wondering if the people who are interested in them, you had said that there was this idea about they've run out of options, but I also wonder if there's a certain number of people who might be turning to AI because they are feeling a lot of fears around stigma and or a lot of disconnection or social isolation. And so I wonder if there's a different kind of almost network process at play here with those folks, right? So, I mean, I think you talked very articulately just a minute ago about the importance of peers or even sometimes celebrities or pomodores or other sorts of influential people for people adopting these mental health apps that might augment their therapeutic experience. But I'm wondering if there's maybe an isolation or a social isolation drive that is happening that might be a part of what's happening with AI. And if you've had any inklings or inclinations or hints of that in the interviews that you've done, or are your people just more connected than that because they're people that are willing to be involved in research studies, and so they're not quite as maybe socially isolated as the folks who might be using AI in these other ways? I'm curious. I don't have a very well articulated question other than I keep thinking isolation and AI therapy have something to do with one another potentially down the road.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. I haven't I think a couple of folks that come to mind, or the few folks that come to mind who are the heaviest AI users, at least one of them is very socially isolated. But the other one seems to be fairly connected socially, at least with friends and family. However, they don't talk to their friends and family about mental health stuff. At least that's what they shared. And so they found that the only sort of source of support that they could get for mental health related conversation was from ChatGPT and Google Gemini. But yeah, that is a
That's really interesting. And I'll just throw one last little kibitz thing for you to think about there, which is that isolation isn't always I have no one in my life, but isolation could mean I have no one in my life around with whom I can share certain facts or certain parts of my life, or that I'm missing certain key people from my life. So it might be that there is an isolation story in there, although you've got an N of two that you're kind of referencing. So I mean, but I mean, I think it's such an interesting and quickly moving place or set of ideas that are happening that it's just really great to hear you um, trying to learn more about it. So thanks for indulging my wanderings there, John.
Great.
You guys saw the nice.
Yes, I was interested in the PNF study and why particularly Black and Asian young adults were looked at and maybe any findings.
Yeah, that might be a good question for Dr. O too, as far as like the setup of why specifically Black and Asian. I think from my understanding, as far as the PNF study as a whole is part of this larger study of looking at personalized normative feedback. So basically, not an area I'm as familiar with. Again, maybe Dr. O's on the call. Might be able to explain a bit more about the intervention, but from my understanding, it's basically trying to present people with who might be say thinking that, about a certain particular barrier to seeking mental health support, for example. So perhaps thinking that most people in my age group won't seek mental health support, then challenging that with sort of more data-based or I guess like percentages that show that or that counter that thinking. But I think for specifically this work, I've mostly looked at the API folks. And I think next steps as far as looking at how it translates to perhaps the Black participants would be interesting. I think based on just looking at the data descriptively, I remember seeing that there were some differences in terms of what factors were driving the intent to use digital mental health. So yeah, I think it would be interesting by that.
Alrighty, thank you. Time is up. So like, thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much for the, giving us an awesome talk and conversation. Thank you.